Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Brendan Cole. The Deputy Prime Minister, Nick Clegg, told listeners of his phone-in radio show that he and his wife may send their oldest son to a private school. But he was accused of hypocrisy because in the past he has talked about the huge social division caused by private education. In a speech to the Sutton Trust last year, Mr Clegg, who himself went to the elite Westminster School in London, described how there is a great rift in the education system between the best schools, most of which are private, and the schools that ordinary families rely on. Mr Clegg has also put social mobility at the heart of his deputy premiership. Indeed, that link between social mobility and education was highlighted in a report last year by the all-party parliamentary group on social mobility. It found that over half of journalists, 3/4 of High Court judges and half of doctors went to private schools, even though only 7% of the population do. It found that the UK is the least socially mobile country in the Western world. So what is at play here? Do we have any right to know which schools politicians send their children to? How tied up is this issue with social mobility and class? And what is the broader issue of private versus state schools? Well, to discuss this, I'm joined by Mark Thompson. He's a Liberal Democrat political blogger. Also in the studio here is Conrad Landon. He's a Labour activist and associate editor of Left Futures. On the line, I'm joined by Barnaby Lennon, who's chairman of the Independent Schools Council and a former headmaster of Harrow School. And also on the line is Elke Segal-Cuthbert, who's a teacher and a researcher in the philosophy of education. A warm welcome to you all. Thank you very much for joining me. Mark Thompson, I'd start with you. What did you make of Nick Clegg's comments? At first sight, a lot of the criticism was that do as I say, but just don't do as I do.
I don't think that's very fair. I think Clegg answered a straight question with as honest an answer as he could give. I mean, I did listen to the phone-in show, and the question was actually posed by the host of the show as an aside from the callers. Clegg prefaced his answer with a pretty detailed explanation of how he realises this is a hot political topic. So he knew what he was getting into, but he answered it, I think, with a straight answer. And I think it's unfair to accuse him of hypocrisy. What he wants to do is improve the standard of state schools. He's never said that people shouldn't send their children to private schools. So I don't think he's being hypocritical in the way that other politicians say. Someone like Diane Abbott, for example, a few years ago got into a lot of trouble because she had railed against private schools and then she had sent her own children to private schools. And I think it's a little bit like, if a politician is making lots of statements about family values and using their family in their campaigning and then they're caught cheating on their spouse, then I think that's fair game. But if they're not being hypocritical, then I don't really see why it's any of our business.
By raising the idea that it's socially corrosive and then going to opt for private education, that is a degree of hypocrisy, isn't it?
I don't think so. And I think we have to be very careful here because Nick Clegg's children should not be used or be seen as political pawns in a game that's being played regarding his own career. Him and his wife, and I think it's important to underline the fact that it has to be him and his wife's decision about this. I think that in the end, they have to make the decision that's right for their own children. And I think there is a risk that if we keep going down this line of not allowing politicians to make decisions like this without them being accused of hypocrisy, you're not going to get people wanting to go into politics.
Conrad Landon, what's your view? Do you think, political statements to a point some would say that they are meaningless if politicians don't apply them to themselves? Do you see it as an innocent 11-year-old being used as a political pawn?
To start with, I think hypocrisy is a bit of a side issue here. I think the important thing is the act itself. And whenever this subject is raised, we hear time and time again that, of course, we must accept that what every politician wants is to do the best for their children. And that sounds pretty reasonable. But actually, the best for my children usually means better than other people's children. That's what people pay for at a private school. And for anyone in a position of representation, anyone responsible for our state schools to be taking that decision is very ethically questionable. And Nick Clegg says that he doesn't want to turn his eldest child into a political football. That's what he said very clearly on the radio. But I would seriously question whether sending your kids to state school is a political act. 93% of families do it. Are they all taking political decisions in doing so? No, on the contrary, I would argue that sending your children to private school is the political act here. It's because in doing so, you are deciding that it's acceptable to buy advantage for your children and to segregate young people on the basis of wealth. And I think it's pretty out of touch for Nick Clegg to suggest that sending his children to state state school is using them as a political football, because for the vast majority of the population, that's just what they do.
Barnaby Lennon, you're a former headmaster of Harrow School. Is it a political act?
Well, we know that most parents in this country would send their children to independent schools if they could. I mean, I don't think that Nick Clegg or any other politicians that are prominent in this area have criticised independent schools. They're not saying there's anything wrong with independent schools. They're saying that independent schools are the model that they hope that all maintained schools will aspire to in terms of the very good exam results that they get and the subjects that their students are encouraged to study and their excellence at sport and pastoral care and all of those sort of things. And this government in particular, and including Nick Clegg, have been keen to use independent schools as the model for state schools, and the academies and the free school movements are an explicit recognition of the fact that independence brings huge benefits.
But also not exactly a vote of confidence in state schools.
I mean, state schools are improving all the time, and the academies and free schools movement, as I say, based on independent schools, is proving to be successful. I mean, we're only 3 years into this government, so, they'll need time. I mean, I would have said it's a vote of confidence in independent schools, the approaches that they are taking.
Can I question on that subject? On what basis you're saying that the academies and free schools have been successful? The statistics actually show that the success of schools hasn't been dependent on whether or not it's been an academy or not, and that schools, comprehensive schools, dependent on other circumstances, dependent on teaching, have been equally likely to be successful schools.
No, the evidence suggests that schools which convert to academies are improving at a faster rate than...
Well, that's because this government has specifically encouraged the top achieving schools to convert to academy status. No. That was the intention when Michael Gove came in. All top schools were written to and encouraged to become academies and offered essentially financial incentives to do so.
No, many of the academies that have converted have been the lowest achieving schools, so that's not true.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London, and we're discussing private versus state education with Mark Thompson, Conrad Landon, Barnaby Lennon, and Elke Segal-Cuthbert. So I want to get the opinion of Elke Segal-Cuthbert, who is a teacher and a researcher. What do you think about, just on the political aspect? I mean, we know that, I guess, private schools show how good schools can be, so there's something aspirational. Is it wrong for a politician to want the best for their children, to send their children to these kinds of private schools?
Absolutely not. I mean, I think there's absolutely nothing wrong with any person, politician or otherwise, wanting the best for their child. And I think the far bigger problem for education, all education, are the kind of views and ideas that Conrad Landon's putting forward, really, because what that does is really reduce education to kind of socio-economic factors, and it ignores the main thing, which is that of knowledge itself. And I think you look at the Sutton Trust's own report from 2008, they're committed to social equality and mobility, and they have to admit that apart from money and culture, the main thing that independent schools have that is so desirable is that their pupils are able to demonstrate a far deeper and broader understanding of their subjects. And I think it's that is the real key and heart of education that's missing from nearly virtually all discussions today.
But Elke, what about our attitude towards private schools? I mean, a couple of weeks ago, there was quoted in the media Frances King, who's the outgoing head of Rodine, complaining that the independent sector has been through what she described as a bruising time. I mean, is there a kind of discrimination against this the independent schools?
Well, yes, I can see why, because basically anybody that wants to try and uphold the idea of academic standards or knowledge as being an intellectual pursuit is immediately condemned as being elitist or terribly out of date, sort of throwback to mid-19th century in a real caricatured version. And that's just mistaken. It fundamentally bypasses a whole wealth of thought and thinking and research that actually shows that academic knowledge, a broad, balanced academic curriculum, is by far the best for all pupils, irrespective of background.
A broad, balanced academic curriculum is exactly what is being under attack from the current government. We've seen Michael Gove taking off a diverse range of historical figures from such as Mary Seacole from the history curriculum, something which Nick Clegg has actually voiced his opposition to.
By just citing a single name, you're showing your own rather reduced understanding what a broad and balanced curriculum is. This has been
a broad and balanced curriculum includes art subjects and value values arts subjects in a way in which the English baccalaureate does not value arts subjects. We have seen arts subjects demonised by the current government.
I mean, I'll go quickly. What's your reaction to that?
So I think it's just wrong. I mean, the 2008 English literature specifications from one main board that's used has over 9,000 routes into the literature course. So which gives you an indication that the problems of curriculum content, are not just the result of Gove, and the interference from left and right into the curriculum has been going apace since the 70s.
Barnaby Lennon, I would like to get your view on comments by people like Francis King and also Vicky Tuck, the former headmistress of Cheltenham Ladies College. She said that she had been made to feel that running a private school in England was, quote, slightly immoral. Is that sector of education under unfair scrutiny, under unfair criticism?
No, I don't recognise that at all, really. I think that quite a lot of these head teachers have been misquoted or selectively quoted. The last census that we conducted last year showed that the number of pupils coming to our schools was going up. In terms of university admissions, again, our research has shown that this year our results will have been the best that we've ever achieved. And actually, the general mood is one of confidence and success within the independent sector.
Mark Thompson, do you recognise that independent schools are a source of social division, as critics would say?
Yes, to an extent. I can understand why people say that, and I can see it as well in society. I mean, I personally was educated at a comprehensive school. I've got to be honest, I'm not trying to blow my own trumpet here, but I was a fairly bright kid, and I did sometimes feel in that school like I had to pretend I was less intelligent than I actually am. I used to, not answer some of the questions in the class. At first, when I was very enthusiastic, and then it was kind of made quite clear to me by some of the other pupils, that wasn't really on. You're a bit of a swot. Don't do that. I'm sure that wouldn't have happened if I'd been at an independent school, because I do feel that, they are more places where it's seen as good to be learning. But to come to the broader point, I think that there is a real problem in this country with social mobility, and I don't think it's the independent schools that cause this problem. I think they're just a symptom of what is actually built upon a fairly stratified hierarchical class system that we still have. And I know we like to think that we're a classless society now, but that just isn't true. I think another aspect of this that's very important is the fact that this big problem that we have with internships in this country, unpaid positions, and you listed a series of professions at the start of this. And I'm sure one of the main reasons why so many children from poor backgrounds are locked out of those professions is not necessarily because of their educational background. It's because to break into those professions, you have to work for 3 months, 6 months, a year, 18 months unpaid, often in London. If your parents don't already live in London and or can't afford to pay for you to not have a wage for that long, then kids are locked out of these jobs in these industries. And if we're going to look at this, it's not good enough to just try and blame the private schools. There's a whole culture that we have in this country that I think we need to do something to tackle. And I think, to be fair about Nick Clegg has led from the front on talking about these internships. He was also accused of hypocrisy on that because he came from a family background that was able to get him a position, an internship where he did quite well. But the fact that he came up through that system, he knows how rotten it is. He's trying to do something about it, and I think he should get some credit for that.
On the point of social mobility and this report, I raised it earlier on about the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Social Mobility. I'd like to bring in Elke Segal-Cuthbert. What do you think? Do you think we obsess over education's role in its ability to increase social mobility?
Yes, I do think that's one of the main problems of the way social mobility is discussed at present, is that it really does evade or point to a failure on the part of politicians and policymakers and some educationalists to really acknowledge that and face up to the best motors for social mobility are going to be, large-scale political and economic decisions. And the more the conversation focuses on education, the less focuses on that, and also the effects of that within education are, as I alluded to earlier, kind of really detrimental. Some figures, you can see that, their attempts to try and use education as a motor for social mobility has led to an increase of young people in higher education from the 80s onwards. But it's also, that's also led to an increase in the number of young people in families with an income below the national average. It just shows you there isn't that kind of causal effect between more education, more social mobility. All that happens is that you end up really destroying the limited capacity that education has, because it will never be an economic driver. It can't be. That's not its role or purpose.
Conrad Landon, do we focus too much on education as a driver of social mobility?
I mean, I think Elke has a point there. I mean, in the Cabinet Office paper on social mobility, which Nick Clegg put together in 2011, where he attacked the corrosive effects of the private schools he's now considering using for his son, he also quoted research from Leon Feinstein, which found that the attainment gap actually opens significantly earlier in children's lives, and education can have a significant effect there, but often it's at the areas which we don't think about. And yes, unpaid internships are a huge problem, but a lot of children's chances are determined very early on in the early years. This is also very interesting in terms of private schools. We often hear from the private school lobby a justification that they are helping social mobility through the bursaries they provide, but actually this research has found that bursaries cannot be that helpful because of the fact that so much is determined from an early age. By the time pupils start applying for bursaries, their fate is already set.
Well, Conrad, what would you do about the education system and about private schools? Because the logical conclusion of what you're saying seems to me that we should ban them. Is that what you would like to see happen?
I would support a ban in private schools. I mean, I don't think that's going to happen under the current under the current government, for sure. I mean, but one simple step that this government should take, which isn't radical at all, is to end tax breaks for private schools. And private schools are currently ludicrously classed as charities. Charities taking from the poor and giving to the rich.
I would actually agree with that.
And at this time, when this government is taxing the poorest families for daring to think that their children deserve their own bedrooms, they're refusing to tax the wealthiest families. And there you have Nick Clegg's priorities.
Can I get the response of Barnaby Lennon, the former headmaster of Harrow School? That is controversial, isn't it? A charitable tax break for private schools with the idea that they're providing a public service, a public good, but it's only a public good that's available to a very select few people.
Well, independent schools have been charities for hundreds of years, and the advancement of education, is in law a charitable purpose. I mean, our schools are not profit-making. It's true that we get some tax relief, which may, if one looks at it generously, add up to about £100 million a year. But we're educating 500,000 pupils in this country, and that's saving the state about £3 billion in terms of their education. The Sutton Trust research showed that, if one's talking about social division, that social division in this country was not within schools was not being created by independent schools, which are a very small part of the overall group, but mainly grammar schools and middle-class comprehensive schools, which are more white middle class than most independent schools are. I mean, I agree basically with the point that's been made, which is the problem with social mobility in this country is not on the whole schools, but family breakdown and the failure of parents to bring up their children properly. I mean, that is what the Sutton Trust research
But the problem with framing this whole conversation around social mobility is that is still only offering opportunities to a very limited number of pupils. Even if your private schools were offering their services purely to those with young, most intelligent children, independent of advantage, which isn't possible anyway. Even if that was the case, then you are still creating an educational elite at the age of 11.
But having said that, though, the report that you refer to actually said that a key factor in social mobility is what happened before the age of 3, and the amount of input that a parent would have, which suggests that government policy should really focus on the onus on parents encouraging their children before they even get to school.
Yeah, I really have to disagree with that. I think there's a real infantile determinism going on here, which is actually incredibly corrosive and intrusive into people's personal family lives, and it also excuses the abdication of educationalists to look into why his education is failing. That has nothing to do with private schools. And it has everything to do with the fact that, really kind of lost their understanding and ability to uphold knowledge as knowledge and understand what a subject is and how you go about teaching it.
We're discussing private versus state education. Joining me in the studio is Mark Thompson, a Liberal Democrat political blogger, Conrad Landon, a Labour activist and associate editor of Left Futures, Barnaby Lennon, chairman of the Independent Schools Council, and Elke Segel-Cuthbert, who is a teacher and researcher in philosophy of education.
Well, I think that there is an awful lot that schools and early years learning can do in those early years, and it's not just before the age of 3, it's in the early years of education as well. As you say, we have to think about what the government can realistically do. If there is evidence to suggest that it's determined early, then it begs the question, what are parents paying for in private schools? And it would seem that if students aren't getting particularly worse exam results, middle-class students at state schools, then what they're buying is the connections and what's rather horribly called cultural capital and the preparation they get for the elite universities.
Well, this kind of thing that we're hearing from Conrad and we hear from people on the left, it's the kind of thinking that has led to where we are now, which is there are hardly any grammar schools left in this country now. The grammar schools, I mean, I didn't go to one, and I don't think they were really around in my part of the country by the time I was old enough to go to secondary school. And it seemed to be a concerted campaign that, comprehensives have to be for everyone. And that's made things worse, I think, because it did used to be that there were those schools and they were available to children from poorer backgrounds who did well enough. OK, it was the 11 plus, and you could argue that, maybe a single exam at a specific age isn't the right way to do it, and there should have been other entry points as well. But it almost seems like because people like John Prescott failed his 11 plus and other politicians who ended up in senior positions in the last few decades, that they just wanted to sweep them away. And now they're only remain in a few places, but the places where they remain, they're still very, very popular. And I mean, this idea that you can just ban private schools, and all that will happen is that rich people will send their children to be educated abroad. I really don't understand.
But how many students are there at grammar schools and private schools with free school meals? The overwhelming evidence suggests that any selective schools, all selective schools, are overwhelmingly dominated by middle-class people. The idea that grammar schools promote social mobility is a myth.
It's not a myth.
In a few cases, which have become the textbook cases, which have become the media anecdotes, you will have someone who is from disadvantaged background who is successful. The idea that somehow most of our politicians, most of our Labour politicians have been from positions of failing the 11 plus is ludicrous, because our political class is so dominated by an Oxbridge educated, privately educated elite.
Well, I don't think we're better off without the grammar schools, and I don't think children from poorer backgrounds are better off without the grammar schools. I think they were an opportunity in a way.
For very few. Well, and what about the rest? The rest get left on the scrap heap.
So why didn't we have more grammar schools then? Wouldn't that have been a better option than getting rid of them?
The only way in which grammar schools can work is if they cream off the elite. The rest are left in secondary moderns, and that is what we are seeing. That's what will happen. Also, that's also the effect of bursaries at private schools.
Sorry, but I really
we end up with sink schools.
I really do think
those students just get written off at the age of 11.
This thinking, this kind of
when they're not even developed.
This line of thinking that you're following, I think, is what has led to the morass that we're in at the moment. I'm afraid.
Can I just bring him back in, Barnaby Lennon? I would be interested in your opinion on the comments made by Anthony Selden, the Master of Wellington College, who warned that privately educated pupils were being discriminated against when they apply for university places. Is this really true?
No, this is completely untrue. The independent schools have researched this question of university access every year, and apart from a small bust-up with Bristol about 10 years ago, there was no evidence whatsoever of discrimination against pupils from independent schools. And as I've already said, the fact is that this year independent schools did better than ever before in terms of university entry. So there is no evidence for this.
Well, the head of Rodin also implied that there was some sort of bias in the media against private schools.
Yeah, well, of course there's a bias in the media.
There certainly isn't, because actually I've stopped reading the Sunday papers, more or less, because you can hardly open any of them without reading an article in defence of private schools. We get the same article over and over again, guilty journalists trying to justify their choices, demonising state schools along the way.
You hear an awful lot against the kind of point that private schools only represent privilege, and people that send their children to them are just buying connections. That may be true of some people, but so what? I think the main reason why most people would want to send their children to private schools, irrespective of whether they can afford to or not, is because they know that basically the teachers at private schools are subject specialists.
Well, they know that they know that they are buying their children something better than what is available to most families.
Instead of saying let's stop what's good, why not argue for extending that for everyone? Why not argue that? Why not have a look?
But
why not
my point is that you can't extend it for everyone.
Off for a minute and look at what works educationally, and you'll find that is very closely linked to subject knowledge and subject specialists.
The point I've been trying to make is that it doesn't work like that, because what parents are buying is not just something that is of high quality. It is something of better quality than what is available to other parents. They are buying, and that can only work when they are in an elite position. That can only work when there is when most of the population is being denied that.
Want those badges like that, and I think really. The fact is most ordinary people, as has been said, would send their kids to private school if they could afford it. Are you saying that they just want to have their little status badges as well? Or could it possibly be the case that actually people instinctively recognise the value of proper academic education?
Well, I would just say, goodbye society. Don't we have any concept wider than ourselves and our own families? Don't we have any sense of a wider society, of something that is more important than just our own advancement and our own children?
Conrad, I'd just like to ask Alka quickly, just on the point of private schools, and 7% of pupils are in private schools, but they account for 43% of the new Oxford intake. I mean, what do you make of government's drive to widen access to higher education? Do you see it happening?
This year's the first year that the Oxbridge intake has been more from state sector than the private sector. And that's a result of, sort of quite a concerted effort over several years of policy and public debate focusing on that, and also the work of, hard-working sixth form teachers in the state sector to ensure that, their pupils with an academic talent, manage to get places there, which is perfectly right. But I do think there's a kind of real problem if we conflate the idea of elitism with the idea that not everybody is going to be academic. Not everyone is going to be Leonardo, Einstein, or not not everybody will have an aptitude for plumbing or what have you. We are different, and this idea of the kind of which has come most forcefully from the left is the idea that if you show an academic talent, somehow it's automatically elitist and to be frowned upon.
And just bringing it back to where we started the discussion on Nick Clegg, Barnaby Lennon, do you think there will come a time when the debate will shift away from what the politicians are doing and really more towards what their policies are?
Well, I hope that the debate will move away from a concern about politics and these poor individual children to standards, because what independent schools represent in this country, and we are some of the best and highest achieving schools in the world, is very high standards of learning, pastoral care, and a real commitment to worthwhile activities outside the classroom. That's why parents send their children to our schools. We're some of the best schools in the world. We should be making more use of this national resource by encouraging independent schools to grow.
Mark Thompson, I'll give you the last word.
Yeah, it was just that point that you just asked about, whether or not politics will move away from this. Unfortunately, I don't think it will. I think the structure and the nature of our politics is becoming ever more about, individual politicians. You've only got to look at the debates before the last election. I'm pretty sure that they'll keep happening now. And it always does seem to be focused on individual politicians and their own lives. It's almost become a little bit like a soap opera. So I think we're being a little bit optimistic if we think that we're going to be able to avoid that in future, unfortunately, because I don't necessarily think it's a good thing.
Well, sadly, we've run out of time. Thank you very much, Mark Thompson, Liberal Democrat political blogger, Conrad Landon, who's a Labour activist and associate editor of Left Futures, Barnaby Lennon on the line, chairman of the Independent Schools Council and former headmaster of Harrow School, and Alka Siegel-Cuthbert, who's a teacher, and she's doing a PhD in the philosophy of education. Thank you very much for joining me, Brendan Cole, here on The Voice of Russia in London. Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Brendan Cole. The Deputy Prime Minister, Nick Clegg, told listeners of his phone-in radio show that he and his wife may send their oldest son to a private school. But he was accused of hypocrisy because in the past he has talked about the huge social division caused by private education. In a speech to the Sutton Trust last year, Mr Clegg, who himself went to the elite into, but he answered it, I think, with a straight answer. And I think it's unfair to accuse him of hypocrisy
what he wants to do is improve the standard of state schools. He's never said that people shouldn't send their children to private schools. So I don't think he's being hypocritical in the way that other politicians say. Someone like Diane Abbott, for example, a few years ago got into a lot of trouble because she had railed against private schools and then she had sent her own children to private schools. And I think it's a little bit like, if a politician is making lots of statements about family values and using their...
For joining me. Mark Thompson, I'd start with you. What did you make of Nick Clegg's comments? At first sight, a lot of the criticism was that do as I say, but just don't do as I do.
I don't think that's very fair. I think Clegg answered a straight question with as honest an answer as he could give. I mean, I did listen to the phone-in show, and the question was actually posed by the host of the show as an aside from the callers. Clegg prefaced his answer with a pretty detailed explanation of how he realises this is a hot political topic. So he knew what he was getting.
So what is at play here? Do we have any right to know which schools politicians send their children to? How tied up is this issue with social mobility and class? And what is the broader issue of private versus state schools? Well, to discuss this, I'm joined by Mark Thompson. He's a Liberal Democrat political blogger. Also in the studio here is Conrad Landon. He's a Labour activist and associate editor of Left Futures. On the line, I'm joined by Barnaby Lennon, who's chairman of the Independent Schools Council and a former headmaster of Harrow School. And also on the line is Elke Segal-Cuthbert, who's a teacher and a researcher in the philosophy of education. A warm welcome to you all. Thank you very much. Westminster School in London described how there is a great rift in the education system between the best schools, most of which are private, and the schools that ordinary families rely on. Mr. Clegg has also put social mobility at the heart of his deputy premiership. Indeed, that link between social mobility and education was highlighted in a report last year by the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Social Mobility. It found that over half of journalists, 3/4 of High Court judges and half of doctors went to private schools, even though only 7% of the population do. It found that the UK is the least socially mobile country in the Western world.